So welcome everyone to this evening's webinar. It is about restoring wetlands and streams. And it is presented by Kristen Andersen. Kristen, could you tell us a little bit about yourself just to start us off here today?
Yeah, absolutely. I am a restoration ecologist and a wetland scientist. I've been working as a consultant for 23 years. I live in the Edmonton area, and I also work for the University of Alberta. I'm an instructor through the Faculty of Extension, and I teach a couple of wetland courses there, one in wetland assessment, and the second one in wetland restoration construction.
Oh, that's great. Take her away. Thank you. Everyone else, please mute yourselves.
Well, thanks very much, Michael, for having me to talk to you in the group this evening. So what I wanted to do is talk about how wetlands and riparian area have an important function in watershed health, and just how we can restore some of these areas and see a lot of benefits. And particularly, I think as we move into the age we're in, there's more and more need to look at nature-based solutions. So that's something that I provide for a lot of different projects and some examples. Climate change is certainly something in the forefront of our mind these days, and what we can expect to see more extreme precipitation and more extreme droughts. When we think about those things, we want to, in the case of more extreme precipitation, can expect potential flooding issues. So we think about how can we be more prepared for that as communities, and in the case of drought, how can we have water available to us and during those periods. And we being adaptive to climate change, some of the terms I wanted to just share with you. One is just trying to build our adaptive capacity. So that's not our goodness of fit to unexpected hazards, it's really our flexibility in the face of the unexpected. We think about climate change mitigation, it's basically mitigation is ultimately reversing a root cause. So if we know greenhouse gases are causing climate change, how can we reduce them? But really what I focus on is resilience. And that's what I like to define it as our ability to absorb a disturbance but maintain function. And so when we think about watershed health, we often try to think, how can we build resilience into that watershed? I like this sort of diagram of the hydrologic cycle on the right of the screen there, because I think it does a good job showing how precipitation and so on and so forth can really impact erosion and flooding problems, which a lot of our communities have these days, particularly with a couple of wet years we've had. We know that water will fall, get more precipitation, and infiltrate. At some point, the ground gets totally saturated and it's totally run off. The other thing that happens, obviously, is with the increase of impervious surfaces or compact soils that are also going to cause more water to be run off and less of it to spread out and get back into the ground. I like how they put in this diagram percolation right underneath the trees, because trees have a tremendous function in promoting infiltration and percolation into the deeper groundwater system. So as, again, just as simple as replacing treed areas with farmland or parks and lawns, we're going to see a lot less infiltration. Trees have root systems that create pipelines down into the soil, really help that water get to the deeper groundwater system. So of course, the more runoff we have, the more peak flows we're going to see in our creeks and in our lakes and in our ditches, and again, these flooding problems become more and more of an issue. So I like to put this in the context of watershed health, because watershed health is inextricably linked to all our problems related to erosion and flooding. So first I want to talk about wetlands. I'm going to talk about streams and shoreline restoration after, but just so we get on the same page on what a wetland is, this is the definition from our Alberta wetland policy: land saturated long enough to have formation of water-altered soils and growth of water-tolerant vegetation. So basically what this is saying is it's wet long enough to have a certain kind of plants and soils. And actually we have, since 2015 in Alberta, You'd think it'd be longer than that. In 2015, we have a standardized protocol that explains exactly what kind of soils and plant indicators will help an area qualify for a wetland. So essentially what that is an area has to have most of its dominant plant species be a wetland plant, or be a facultative wetland or obligate plant. And there's actually a list where all of those indicator statuses are assigned. And then we also have a very concise list of hydric soil indicators. So that's digging a soil pit and looking in the soil to see if you meet a criteria. And really, this kind of one of two things. You're either going to have your soil be organic, so the picture on the far right, for at least 20 centimeters. Actually, just need 20 centimeters of organic to qualify. And or you would have the other picture there where you see the sort of grayish colors and mottles present. And so those are sort of some common indicators. And the reason you see those grayish colors and those reddish mottles is because iron, being one of the most common minerals in the soil, when it's oxidized is red and rusty colored. When it's in its reduced form, what happens is it becomes soluble in water, and it can actually move around with soil water. And so you'll have areas where iron's been depleted in the soil profile, and areas where it reoxidizes in the form of these sort of bright red patches or models. So these are the kinds of things we look for. We obviously have 5 different major classes: marshes, areas that have less than 25% woody veg; swamps, at least 25% woody veg; shallow open waters, at least 25% open water midsummer; and then our fens and the bogs are the ones that have 40 centimeters or more of organic soil. So wetlands really have got their protection status because they provide important functions and values. I mean, it kind of dates back to the 70s when wetlands started getting a lot of attention, where it was becoming recognized that the loss of wetlands was contributing to issues around drinking water supplies getting contaminated or flooding issues happening. So anyways, this is a long list of functions and values that wetlands do provide. I'm just going to hone in on a few of them, but certainly flood abatement is a big one that we focus on. The ability to improve water quality and replenish groundwater and protect our shorelines from erosion. So some of the big ones. When it comes to water quality, what wetlands allow is for water to spread out and slow down. And what happens in that case, anytime water slows down, sediment drops out. So that's really important. So it's not being carried down further down to our receiving waters, like our rivers and lakes, which are ultimately generally going to be our drinking water supplies. So it also helps remove nutrients by the plants that live in there. It can take up some of the nutrients, but also actually soils are tremendously effective in wetland soils, particularly their role in the global nitrogen cycle. So I talked about all these processes that go on in wetland soils. What happens is when wetlands soils, they're loaded with microbes. Most soils are loaded with microbes. They should be anyway. Is when they don't have good old-fashioned oxygen available because they're waterlogged, is they'll go to things like nitrate and pull oxygen molecules off that, and up in the air goes nitrogen gas, which our atmosphere is mostly comprised of nitrogen gas. Anyway, so really important in that function as well. And then also ability to pull contaminants out. So this is just a couple of pictures of areas that are probably receiving a lot of fertilizer and a lot of nutrients. And again, when you have ditches that move water quickly, you're not going to get that function as if you had wetland basins that can really hang on to that water and allow those soil and processes and those plant metabolic processes to remove those toxicants and nutrients. Same thing with heavy metals, the ability to either pull that into the plant material or sometimes convert it into less harmful forms. Ability to replenish groundwater. Again, water needs a place to spread out and slow down. And now, don't get me wrong, not every single wetland recharges groundwater, but wetlands are undeniably a place where groundwater recharge and discharge happen. So we think about groundwater discharge. That's water going from the ground to the surface water. It's discharge. Groundwater recharge is going from surface back into the ground. So, not a lot of processes to confirm that on a quick glance, but what happens is we have much of our geology is in Alberta is glacial till, and places where there's fractures in that material. Glacial till is very, very dense material underlying our soil. There's places where that fractures, and if water doesn't have a place to hang out, it's not going to make it back in there. So not every wetland, again, provides this function. Some wetlands will provide some discharge and recharge functions in different parts of the wetland, but undeniably, without wetlands, we are going to lose that replenishment of our groundwater supplies. Flow regulation, I mentioned, wetlands allow water to spread out and slow down. As those wetland basins are smoothed out and filled in, and so on and so forth, we're going to see that water travel from the upper part of our watershed to the lower part, making our creeks and our lakes swell up a lot more quickly. And so that temporary storage creates a braking action as water moves across the landscape. I also, get to the next slide here, wanted to talk about ecosystem goods and services. This is the concept that wetlands provide goods and services based on their natural functions. They contribute to human well-being. And there's been a number of systems over the years where studies that have attempted to try to put like a dollar value on that, like how much are we gaining from that? And there are some pretty interesting studies out there that economic standpoint are very important to us as societies, but it's tricky. It's easy to put a dollar value on things you can buy and sell in a market, like timber, fish, but it's a little more difficult to do that when, well, how much money are we saving when we don't have a flood? How much money, are we saving by having to clean our water less? And it's kind of difficult to do that. But one thing we can say with certainty is that the research, it tells a story. As societies, it is a lot of economic benefit to having these sort of natural assets on our landscape as well. So we have a system, in our regulatory system, we have a means of trying to mitigate those wetland losses, because again, they are so important. The system is called the Wetland Mitigation Hierarchy. It says that any project needs to first try and avoid wetland impacts. If it's unavoidable, let's find a way to minimize our impacts, either reduce our footprint or reduce the intensity of an activity, and then finally replace a wetland. And so the wetland replacement strategies are essentially generally restoring a wetland. So that's kind of the concept of taking a wetland area that used to be wetland, maybe it was drained, and putting a wetland back there, or constructing a wetland where maybe one never existed. And there's really kind of two mechanisms for that. One is undertaken by the permittee. So let's say if I'm Walmart, I'm going to go fill in a hectare of wetland, I can go build another hectare or two to make up for it. But the other option is the in lieu fee program, or actually termed wetland replacement program in Alberta. And the in lieu fee programs are essentially the concept that somebody will pay some money to an agent or an organization. They will release themselves of that liability when they make that payment, and that organization will go and replace those wetlands. And so by far, that's been the most popular option taken, because if you're going to undertake it yourself, you're taking on a lot of work, some risk. That's going to all work out the way you hope it will. So certainly a lot of people will go ahead and pay that fee. Any guesses how much it costs to pay that fee? It's at the moment, it's a bit of a sliding scale depending on where you are in the province. The price changes a little bit depending on your area, but it's about 20,000 or 19,000 and some change per hectare. So let's round it up to 20,000 at the high end, so I could fill a hectare potentially and pay just that amount. That also changes because mitigation ratios kick in. Sometimes a project is hitting a high value wetland and the ratio could be 3 to 1, for example. So 1 hectare filled means 3 to be replaced, so on and so forth. But that's what we're talking about there. So things have changed. Things have changed a lot in the province over the years. I think, from our wetland policy perspective, we're leaps and bounds beyond a lot of other provinces. And there's been a lot happening since the wetland policy got rolled out in 2013 in terms of a new guidance and directives and really we're seeing a lot of really good things happening out there. But think of where we came from. The history was basically it was incentivized to drain wetlands, right? It was promoted to do that. And now we're looking at pretty exciting ways to actually do wetland restoration in this province. One thing about the sort of recent changes is that the Ducks Unlimited Canada was formerly the primary organization doing wetland restoration in the province. And one of the things that happened with the new wetland policy is that the government of Alberta has taken over that funds. And that's kind of exciting because what it will allow is some more diversification of how those wetlands are put back on the landscape. And one of the things that's just been happening over the past few months is systems being set up for other mechanisms to take place. And I think we're going to continue to see this evolve over the years. But over the last few months, one of the major changes is that the province has set up a system to work with municipalities that are interested in doing wetland restoration. And so that allows a municipality to enter into agreement with the provincial government and ultimately carry through with site selection, construction, restoration, and becoming stewards of these wetlands in the long run. So that's really exciting. I'm currently engaged in a number of those projects with a number of different municipalities, and it's really exciting to see some of the projects that are coming to the surface. I'm going to show you some examples of wetland restoration projects just so we all have a little bit of visual to what some of these things look like. This is a project actually at a nature conservancy property called Bunchberry Meadows, not too far from Edmonton. This is a dugout, and like most dugouts, very steep side slopes, very straight shorelines. So what we were able to do is create wetlands around the dugout by taking an excavator and pulling back some of those side slopes, creating peninsulas, bays, tufts, mounds, just giving it a lot of structure, and then installing a number of native plants. So what we have is a very complex shoreline in the end, and quite a diverse plant community as well. So that was a project that we took on last year, actually as part of the wetland restoration course at the University of Alberta. This is another project that we just finished last fall. This is a cultivated field, of course. You can see the picture on the left is from 1976, where the wetland had open water, so we call it permanent wetland, and it has a bit of a natural outlet. And if you look at the historic aerial photographs over the years, you'll see that somewhere in the early 90s, a ditch appeared. And so just flashing to 2017 photo there on the right, that ditch is very well established. There's been no open water in that wetland for many years. You can even see a piece of cultivated land on the right-hand side of that wetland that between the home and the wetland itself that's actually never really grows very well. You can see the picture on the left. It was probably a shrubby swamp in there with lots of willows. Anyways, this was a voluntary wetland restoration project. The landowner felt, I'd much rather see wildlife using this than these struggling crops. And so so we were able to disable the ditch. I'll just show you some pictures. The ditch, what we were able to do is install a core trench and backfill it with clay. And so you can see the excavator digging across the ditch, perpendicular to the ditch, on the top left picture. And on the top right picture, he's just finished backfilling it with material that's fairly high in clay. So what we're doing is we're digging through anything that's kind of highly permeable, organic material, or maybe soil that's sandy and doesn't have a lot of clay. I'm backfilling it with something that's fairly high in clay, bringing them up to that elevation that's going to tie into the adjacent landscape, and is where we estimated was the historic wetland rim. And we can actually take that elevation using a laser level and map out where that wetland will extend to, based on where the elevation of our outlet is going to be, and make sure we're not going to flood any neighbors. We're able to backfill that. We created some deep pools. You can see a picture on the bottom right where the deep pool that we constructed, there's actually 1.9 meters. You can't tell because it filled in with water fairly quickly. I was just out there a few weeks ago. I mean, it's just teeming with wildlife. native plants established. In fact, one of the interesting things about this particular wetland to me was most of the vegetation in that wetland on the 2017 photo, it was Agrostis gigantea. So it's a non-native kind of invasive grass that creates a monoculture. Hey, like when I was out there a few weeks ago, I just didn't see any of it because it was too wet for it, actually, and just loaded with native species. And like I said, wildlife, amphibians, just fantastic. This is another wetland that we restored a couple years ago, is a floodplain wetland. So again, wetlands, water needs a place to spread out and slow down. That's what floodplains are for. And so this particular area, this is a good example of a wetland that was restored by removing fill material that had been placed in it. Very expensive compared to the last couple of techniques I showed you, because you imagine how much work it is and how many hours on an excavator to pull all that fill material out. But we were able to do that, and we were able to give some inlets from the river to enter that wetland, and every spring it just fills right up with water. So again, a pressure relief valve. Without floodplain wetlands, what we find happens is our rivers continue to down cut. The water is nowhere to go but to cut down, and so the force of that, another erosion associated with that, it leaves behind very steep side slopes on your creeks. They eventually collapse and create some significant erosion problems. The next thing I want to talk about is this concept of streams and floodplains. See, this is a picture of a perfectly healthy riparian area. This happens to be the White Mud Creek in Edmonton. I know in a perfectly healthy, riparian area is, got all kinds of healthy riparian vegetation. And a perfectly healthy river system, the river just wide enough, just deep enough, just long enough to handle all of the sediment and debris and ice can be produced by its watershed. When something changes in the watershed, the river adjustment, the channel adjustment process begins. And so, what we can see happen in that case is a lot of erosion issues happening, a lot of slumping of the stream banks. Over the years, there's been a real shift in how I think river scientists and river managers have approached this. Historically, we've really tried to figure out how to keep water in its channel and resist the forces of its flow by armoring it with hard materials. Now I think there's a growing focus on trying to just sort of step back. And actually studies have shown that the most damage is from flood events. When it comes to financial impacts, are not related to inundation-related damage. It's actually stability-related damage. So when you think about these systems undergoing the channel adjustment process due to changes in the watershed, they're quite susceptible from damage during a flood. Like the damage can be catastrophic. Whereas if you have this healthy, stable environment, you can have a flood event and not see all that significant damage happen. If we think about these kinds of sites, they're basically everywhere, and probably all of us can close our eyes and think of a place in our community where there's a stream bank eroding. And when we look at these erosion issues, first thing we ask is why are they eroding? And this is a picture of an outside bend of a creek. That's where flow velocities are always going to be highest. It's on the outside bend. It's just how water moves; it attacks the corner, and so those higher flow velocities tend to create what we call toe erosion or undercutting of the banks. The other thing that happens is a lot of times we'll see the native woody riparian vegetation removed. Maybe it happened decades ago as part of agricultural rural development. In any case, that riparian vegetation has been removed, and then oftentimes we'll see development right at the top of that slope. And what that development is doing is creating compact surfaces. So we're going to see more surface water runoff versus infiltration. So it's sort of the perfect storm. You get the outside bend, impacted, removed riparian vegetation, and then just add water over the slope. So you have an undercutting bank that doesn't have a lot of root mass in it, and then you add some water, make it wet and heavy, and ultimately you'll see this slumping or sloughing happening, and we see it all over our lake shores and our creeks. It's like clockwork. What's left behind after that slump is usually a big escarpment, a big oversteepened slope that on its own won't really vegetate. So the second thing we ask ourselves is will it bounce back itself, or is there a condition that's going to prevent that from happening? And if there is, then probably we need to step in and do some restoration. And in this case, it's oversteepened slope. This is actually a place where a nature trail was placed on the edge of a creek. But again, that trail development required the removal of the trees, the riparian vegetation. And so we have this oversteepened slope that on its own probably won't vegetate. Soil compaction is another major issue. This is a picture of the fire breaks after the Fort McMurray wildfires. And so naturally trees were removed so that the fire couldn't spread to the homes as easily. And bulldozers moved through that area, kind of compacting all that soil. And so this soil compaction is a condition where left alone probably won't bounce back on its own. So these are things that we look at. What can we do to restore these? And then of course, rill and gully erosion is another sort of filter to recovery. And that, we have so much water moving through concentrated areas that vegetation will never catch on its own. It's constantly being washed away. So these are common issues we see. Again, lack of woody riparian vegetation. You can see that in the distance in this picture. Undercutting, we're on the outside bend of a creek. And then excess moisture because maybe developments on the slope just above our site. So outside clockwork, you can go down a lot of our creeks, look at the outside bends of these creeks. And if the riparian vegetation has been removed, that's pretty much what it's going to look like. So some of the techniques we have to restore these areas is soil bioengineering. It's basically the use of plants to perform an engineering function. We use live cuttings of willow, poplar, and dogwood, and we do that because they root really well from a cutting. We can basically take a poplar, for example, and if we cut it, then we have the right size and we trim the side branches and we prepare it the right way. We stick that in the ground, it's going to root from a cutting. And unlike a traditional tree you might plant 30, maybe 50 centimeters down the ground, we can stick these cuttings 1 meter or 2 meters down in the ground and we'll get rooting all along that 2-meter depth. Again, that root mass is going to be really effective at helping to stabilize the soil. It also has the ability to wick moisture because a lot of our slope issues are moisture problems. Usually, again, multiple factors there. The loss of that root mass is going to be an issue. But when our soils get wet and heavy, they're going to be a lot more prone to landslide activity, slumping, sloughing. And so the other great thing this vegetation is capable of doing is pulling excess moisture that's contributing to that. May say actually a mature poplar tree can pull over 100 gallons of soil water out a day, and of course that's a mature tree, but with soil bioengineering, we work in strength in numbers. We put these things in densely, and we can see an immediate effect. They're self-sustaining, self-healing, so you can have a massive storm event or ice action. Maybe everything gets, mowed down, but they'll sprout back twice as thick. And so it's very self-sustaining system. And then there's tons of environmental benefits, biodiversity support, wildlife habitat, aesthetic value as well, ability to sequester carbon. This is a picture of a landslide we fixed up near Grand Prairie, and this is a reservoir, and there's been a landslide into the reservoir, so obviously that's not a good thing. You can see from this picture that the silt is running down into the reservoir from the slope. And what we did is we used live staking with balsam poplar, and we put about 9 cuttings per square meter. Actually, I think there was something like 18,000 cuttings put on this one slope actually. What we do is, again, we take cuttings that are 2 meters long and put at least 1 meter in the ground. And so creating a pilot hole, essentially putting that cutting in and tamping the soil back really well around it. Cutting all the side branches so that the plant knows first thing it has to do is root, and then it can focus on shoot growth after that. So actually one of the guys was coming off the slope one day. This isn't a picture from that slope, by the way. You can see up around here, but it reminds me of the story. They actually did part of the project in the fall and part of it in the spring. And in the spring, he was coming off the slope and he kind of slipped and he grabbed the cutting to get his balance. And he was just shocked at the amount of roots. These things are really effective, as soon as the soil warms up and they can start rooting. This is actually a picture of the growing season immediately following installation. So these cuttings had all of, 2-3 months here to to grow like this. So you have literally a wall of green on the slope, and this is a year after that. So it's a before and after picture. The after picture is a little bit in the fall season, but you can see, there's pretty much a forest growing on that slope now. And I should have got a picture from this year. I didn't, but I occasionally people will go by there and send me a picture, and it's really growing well. So it's a great system we have. The other thing that you can't really see from those pictures is that on the top of the slope, there's a gravel pit, a reclaimed gravel pit. So, and then back in the day, the method of reclaiming gravel pits was to basically kind of smooth out the soil and seed it with grasses and legumes. So again, we're not creating a condition where we get a lot of infiltration, but a lot of runoff. What didn't help is what we have also happening there is a lot of ATV traffic. So the rutting that had been created along the crest of the slope had actually created some places where water could concentrate and flow down the slope. And so that's where we're seeing our landslide issue. So we were able to address all of that by making the upper slope rough and loose and restoring it. And I'll talk about that right away here. This is a good example of a failing slope. This is some pictures from Dave Polster. He's a renowned restoration ecologist and a mentor of mine. So he shared these with me. What you see here is probably not a very uncommon site. They sort of smooth, compact surface, seeded it with grass, but it's failing. So we can use vegetation to restore that. And this is the rough and loose technique I just mentioned. So again, this is creating a condition where you're not going to see water be able to gain a lot of velocity as it moves from the upper slope to the lower slope. By roughening the soil, you're not going to see water move quickly down that slope. And really, erosion issues develop from water moving fast. The faster it moves, the more soil it can take with it. This is actually accomplished using an excavator. So the way we do this is we set an excavator up the base of the slope. He works from the bottom up and take the bucket of the excavator, take a scoop of soil, go about a half a bucket width over, shake that soil out, go next to his first hole, take another scoop of soil, put his bucket halfway between the first and second hole, shake that out, go next to his second hole, take a third hole, and just kind of repeat that process over whatever's a reasonable swing of the excavator back up, doing again now offsetting his second row of holes and mounds from the first row. So you have a bit of a checkerboard effect. So very effective way of dealing with. The other thing we're doing is we're creating a condition that's really good for pioneering vegetation or native woody riparian vegetation to reestablish. There's compact sites, seeding with grass, that's going to really make sure that you don't get any trees and shrubs reestablishing in there. So creating a rough and loose surface is great for getting native woody riparian vegetation back. You're also going to promote a ton of infiltration. So a really effective way of dealing with erosion here. In this case, these guys are installing poplar cuttings in the rough and loose soil treatment area. And so they're putting, again, 2 meter long cuttings, 1 meter in the ground, 1 per square meter in this case. And so after a couple of years, you have a forest. And again, you can see things like the site is sequestering several tons of carbon dioxide every year. This is a couple of pictures here, again, from the wildfire erosion and drainage project that we still have underway here, but I have a couple of pictures for you. Again, tons of runoff. You can imagine all the compact soils and tree removal resulting from the wildfire response activities. And so also starting to see some issues with slumping along some of these slopes. So we were able to use these techniques to also restore that. So this is a slope. There's actually a trail system that runs through here. And at the bottom of the slope, there's a creek, but you can see how long these slopes are. So we were able to make the soil rough and loose and use balsam poplar stakes to help stabilize it. And so that site's starting to really look nice out there. The next technique I wanted to talk about is this dense live toe staking. So we talked about the high flow velocities, particularly on the outside bends of our creeks, oftentimes creating undercutting, and the trail system that was put in here also removed the native woody riparian vegetation. So we have that, again, those issues where undercutting's happening, riparian vegetation was removed, and a lot of times we'll have, again, runoff kind of concentrating and spilling over in these sites, and that's where we see these failures kind of like clockwork. So the dense live toe staking treatment is the idea of taking willow stakes and putting them in very densely because they're in there so densely, what's going to happen is the flow velocities are going to be reduced, because when water hits that toe zone and those dense stakes are there, it's going to slow the flows down. And again, when water slows down, it's less likely to erode soil. In fact, what we see happening in our toe staking zones is sediment deposition. Because again, when water slows down, sediment drops out of it. So we see sediment deposition versus erosion. This is another example of dense live toe staking. This is it was installed the spring of last year. And that's a picture from just a couple months later, so you can't even tell we were there. Another technique is wattle fencing, and this is a technique we use when we have that oversteepened slope. Remember, we have that condition where vegetation is not going to readily reestablish, and so in this particular case, what we're trying to do is create a condition where riparian vegetation can grow. And wattle fencing is one of those techniques. And so what it does is it's basically little mini retaining walls. These guys are putting this in the ground here. You can see the first couple of fences are in and they're putting the last one up, but you have vertical stakes going in, they're fence posts, and then behind there put your horizontal posts. And you can see this person using our planting bars that we use to install these things and cinching those horizontal stakes up against a fence post. And then you just backfill it from soil on the slope above it. And so what you're doing, again, is you're creating a condition where riparian vegetation can grow, unlike those escarpments where it's just too steep for anything to catch. And so it's a picture sort of before and after, and it's a good bioengineering treatment. You really can't tell we were even there. So there are a number of design considerations. Live cuttings need to be installed when they're dormant, actually. You know, in the middle of the summer when they're spending all their energy reproducing and growing, it's not a good time. So we install these things in the spring and in the fall, basically before leaf out and after leaf drop. And so our installation season, you also need non-frozen ground, of course. So our installation season in the spring is basically you know, a ground thaw, which is usually generally mid-April, depending on where your site is, and the sun exposure, and then usually mid-May, so you get about a month in the spring. And you can extend these things with cold storage and things of that nature, but as a rule, we try to just get them installed during the window without needing to do that. The fall construction window usually takes September through freeze up, which is usually mid or early November, so a little bit of a longer season in the fall. All the cuttings get soaked at least for 24 hours before installation. We use locally collected material, so you know, there's no real need to go and purchase this material. Usually there's you know, drive around the countryside and there's just, you know, wetlands and groves of willows everywhere. And so, you know, we can go in and do a collection for several days, and oftentimes you won't even be able to tell we were there. Generally, we install these things by hand, and this is oftentimes one of the things that makes these options really attractive over hard engineering techniques. So things like riprap revetments or gabion baskets are another ways to sort of stabilize some of these lake shores and stream banks. But you know, it requires a lot of heavy equipment to go in. Sometimes that's a safety issue. Sometimes it creates a great deal more restoration just from where the equipment had to access the site. You know, but you know, the other thing is that these treatments have the ability to absorb energy from the wave action or from the high flow periods, whereas those hard revetments really don't. They have the ability to sort of transfer that energy to another place because they don't have that dense vegetation that helps really kind of slow down and absorb that energy. Lower costs compared to hard engineering, to be sure. I mean, I showed you that reservoir, the picture of the reservoir there. I think, you know, it was under $50,000 to fix that, and the hard engineering solution that had been produced through another option analysis was over $1 million to fix that slope. So sometimes that's a big decision-making factor to use these techniques. Sometimes there's grant funding available for these things, and then, you know, reduced regulatory requirements as a rule. You know, things like getting an authorization under the Fisheries Act, for example, would likely not be required in one of these techniques because it's ultimately restoring fish habitat versus some of these other techniques. So, yeah, so that's my presentation. I wanted to open it up for any questions at this point.
Well, thank you very much, Kristen. It was very informative and very helpful. So yeah, I would encourage anybody, you can either use your the chat box to ask your questions there, or if you are wanting to, you can use either the audio or your video to share your questions that way. Colin, you got a question there?
Thank you, Kristen. That was, I've seen this presentation before, and very, very impressed with the technique of, it's such a simple, what do you call it, geoengineering. It's, thank you for presenting this. I hope that we can get the word out. This is something that absolutely anybody can do. All of our rural or agricultural people, our recreation landowners, anybody, like slumping and the runoff, it's just such an easy thing to do. I appreciate that Associated Environmental, you've got great programs and you help out, and there is funding available for people on the bigger projects. We just sort of have to get the word out there to everybody that it could be as simple of a thing. You got a little 4-foot ditch running off of your yard. Go cut some poplars and stick them in there, and you can smarten stuff up. It doesn't have to be a big project.
Yeah, that's so true. And thank you so much for the kind words. And I was only able to show a handful of things with the time we have. I mean, there's a number of other techniques. We talked about your ditch there. I know there's a number of other techniques that didn't show here today that work for those things. So yeah, I encourage you to, if you have a site or you have a friend who has a site, then they might be interested in this. It could, could happily have a Skype or a Google or Teams or one of these kinds of meetings, and we can share pictures and share ideas, because yeah, I think where we're moving as a society, we need to start looking at nature-based approaches. So yeah, if you know somebody with any kind of problems like this, I'm happy to look at their site and one-on-one basis and look at it. The other thing I didn't really touch on very much is, again, this wetland restoration program. So one of the things that we're doing, like I said, I'm working with a number of municipalities right now to build wetlands, and we're entering into these agreements with the provincial government. And so if there are any landowners who are interested in having wetlands built on their property, we now have the money to do that through the wetland replacement program. So again, if you know anyone who's been thinking about that or has a site, I encourage you to pass them my contact information, and we could talk about making some of these projects a reality.
And thank you for working with that pilot project. Hopefully we can put something together with our municipality to, that's still a goal. You're still working with Molly and Randy?
That's right. Yeah. So we were out and did our first site selection field trip, and what we found was a handful of really great candidate sites. And so I know she's working now to try and make some of them happen. And so that's really exciting. We did do a presentation like this before with the municipality, and I was just so impressed with the interest and the synergy. And yeah, so it looks like Lac La Biche County is getting prepared to sign on to the agreement with the Wetland Replacement Program and AEP. So I think we're going to be seeing a lot of, hopefully we can do this presentation in a year and show you some of the wetlands we've restored in Lac La Biche County. And that's, I think, very likely to happen. The other thing that we could look at as opportunities is through workshops and so on. So I do usually several soil bioengineering workshops every year, as well as through the University of Alberta. Our course, actually, the wetland restoration course, is a hands-on course. So we're in a little bit of a pause right now, but perhaps we could look at some of those opportunities. So what we do in the course is spend 2 days in the classroom, 3 days in the field, actually building the wetland, so people get experience working with heavy equipment, installing plants and things like that. So I'm hoping, if, with all of the uptake and excitement around Lac La Biche, that we'll maybe start to see some courses get to run up there as well.
Thank you.
That's great. I have a couple of questions. So when you're doing the wattles, and the dense willow staking at the base of the slopes. Are the wattles expected to, are they made from the same kind of material that's also soaked and it's
Yep,
hoping that they'll sprout as well?
that's right. They will sprout and grow. Yeah, so we use willows and or balsam poplar, a little bit depending on where you are and in terms of moisture regime at this particular site. But yeah, both of those will be used right in the fence material. The one thing I will say about wattle fence construction is it has a propensity, you have to keep it wet. It really needs to be watered. You know, if I see in examples where it doesn't work out, it's usually what happened. It didn't get watered. So when you think about putting a balsam poplar stake a meter in the ground, you've got soil contact on a whole meter of that stake. When you think about how the wattle fences go, so our fence posts are mostly underground and they'll grow extremely well, but all our horizontal stakes have less soil contact than otherwise it could have. So it really does need to be kept wet and watered, usually once a week for the first couple of years. But yeah, you'll see the horizontal stakes as well as the vertical stakes sprout and grow.
Excellent. And have you ever done any restoration work where we've had bad problems with invasive species, like for instance, canary grass?
Yeah, absolutely. And I mean, in my opinion, is the best way to deal with those kinds of invasive species is to shade them out because create conditions that they don't love. And canary grass, as well as pretty much, I think all of our invasive species love sun. And so it's a very effective means of dealing with that issue, just establish shade. And you can again use balsam poplar or willows depending on your site. You might want to look at one or both of those, but live staking is an excellent way to deal with that problem.
Well, I guess that looks like we are not having any more questions, so I guess it's time to wrap it up. So I want to just say thank you very much for doing this for Healthy Waters Lac La Biche, and as I mentioned, we may be putting this onto YouTube or another format to be able to share with other people. Oh, Colin, do you have another question or comment?
And hope that she keeps us in mind when COVID is over, that we can actually have a live presentation, because it is much more involved and informative.
Yeah, and perhaps if
I'd be glad to.
Kristen, if you come up for a live presentation, we should hook you into giving a talk at the college as well, because we do teach some of these concepts in some of our courses at the college. And so a lot of the courses I teach, unfortunately, I don't. I have unfortunately other ones that I have to teach. So, but it would be great to have you come in and give a talk to those as well, or maybe combine them or something. That would be great.
I'd love that. So I'll be sure to stay in touch with you guys when I'm in the area, or you know how to reach me.
Yeah, that's great. All right, well, I guess it's time to wrap it up then. And so thank you everyone who attended today, and of course, Kristen especially, and the Associated Engineering for lending her to us for today. And hope you guys all have a great rest of your evening.